It seems like Elemental Shaman mirror matchups are solely luck dependent. It's always, I could have drawn better, they got lucky, and all of that. But I'm here to tell you that you can win the Elemental Shaman mirror matchup more by utilizing these easy tips I'm about to tell you. The Elemental Shaman mirror matchup is a balancing act between controlling the board, but also dealing damage to the face. In the early game, you generally want to control the board because Whack-A-Mole Hammer is such a powerful card, and losing a minion and having them buff a minion is too powerful for you to handle. In this early game stage before turn 3, try to make your board as wide as possible because there isn't any big removal before that. If you can, make it so your minions have more than 1 health so Earth Revenant doesn't destroy your board. In the stage before turn 4, the most burst damage Elemental Shaman can do is 2 damage attacks from Arid Stormer and 3 damage from Lightning Bolt. If your opponent hasn't played any elementals the turn before, you don't have to worry about the Arid Stormer. When your opponent plays a card that costs 5 or more, then it's time to play around Dunk Tank, but also go face. If you have board control at this point, you can go face a bit more and set up for your lethal. Remember, this deck has no healing, so every bit of damage you do and receive is permanent. That's just a general idea of the deck. If you want to truly win more Elemental Shaman mirror matchups, then you need to stick around to the end of the video because I go really in depth on how to win this matchup. And if you like what you see, why not subscribe because I've got a lot of fun Hearthstone guides, decks, and videos on my channel and more to come. The Mulligan is important because if you win the early game in the mirror matchup, you are way more likely to win due to the general burst damage in this deck. I'm playing this variation of Elemental Shaman because it's the Elemental Shaman most accessible on HS Replay. But this applies to any version of Elemental Shaman too. Every Elemental Shaman card that costs 3 or less mana has 3 health or less, except for Arid Stormer. This means that anything that can deal 3 damage is good in the early game with the exception of Lightning Bolt, which is also good situationally, but we'll get there in a second. This begs the question, what cards do you keep and which cards do you throw away? Well, of course you keep your 1 and 2 cost minions, but what if your mulligan looks like this where you have a 3 cost card and 2 pieces of junk? Do you keep that 3 mana card? Let's look at it card by card and find out the answers. Of course you get rid of Instructor Fireheart, that's obvious. However, Archdruid Naralax is trickier because the cards are random. This could totally work if you get Emerald Drake, but I want a consistent tempo or some removal, and I want a mulligan for my 1 and 2 drops. If you run Gyre Worm, the same logic applies. It's risky to keep Gyre Worm without elementals to play, so I'd get rid of them unless you're feeling extra lucky. However, Serpent Shrine Portal and Whack-A-Mole Hammer are very situational. You can't guarantee that you'll mulligan and get minions to play before it, and it becomes risky to hold on to. But I will say, if you coin out the Serpent Shrine Portal or the Hammer, they become extremely powerful against the 1 and 2 cost minions of the deck. And if you hero power to the turn prior, you can actually buff your totems with it, but that's assuming they don't take out the totems, and that's really complicated, whatever. I would highly suggest keeping both of these cards, but there is a risk, so I'm gonna leave this one up to you. But why would you keep the Hammer if you have no minions? And what about Primal Dungeoneer? To understand why you need to mulligan or keep these cards, we're going to have to look at the openings of this deck and how to counter them. Specifically, the 1 cost cards and what you should do against them. The first opening we're going to look at is a Wailing Vapor. You got Wailing Vapor into whatever you have in the beginning of the game. It doesn't really matter at that point. The point is, Wailing Vapor is a solid card to play on turn 1 because there's so many things you can do with it. If you're going first and your opponent plays Wailing Vapor, you really just need to get minions on the board. That's the only thing you can do. But on turn 3, you've got a few options. You can just put the Whack-A-Mole Hammer and attack into the Wailing Vapor, even if you have no other minions, assuming they don't coin out their own Whack-A-Mole Hammer and attack with their Wailing Vapor, and I'll tell you why that's good in just a second. You can also play a Serpent Shrine Portal, which will go into the Wailing Vapor very nicely, so those are your few options to counter if you're turn 1. But why would you want to coin out your own Whack-A-Mole Hammer if you have a Wailing Vapor on the board? Since Wailing Vapor has 3 health, +1 makes it 4 health. That's basic math, oh my goodness! But the problem with this is all these cards that can deal damage as Elemental Shaman can only deal 3 damage. So a 4 health minion is super scary, especially one that can scale like Wailing Vapor. You can also try to set up for a Arid Stormer, which will always be a solid option the earlier you play it. So let's say they have Wailing Vapor. A really solid way to counter it, if you can draw it, is Kindling Elemental Arid Stormer on turn 2. Because then you got 2 attacks into it, and if even they played Cage Match Custodian, it's even better. Because then you can play Kindling Elemental, this thing's gone, and attack. And now, you suddenly have a 2-1 on the board with Wind Fury, and you're winning the board. If your opponent plays a Wailing Vapor and you go second, you got a lot more options because you have the coin. This is why I say you should keep your Whack-A-Mole Hammer and your Serpent Shrine Portal. If you can coin out Whack-A-Mole Hammer or Serpent Shrine Portal, that means you can take out the Wailing Vapor nice and simply. Plus, they can't get the Whack-A-Mole Hammer before you because you have the coin. Let's go over a few scenarios here. Primal Dungeoneer is really good if you can get Whack-A-Mole Hammer here, because if you play the Whack-A-Mole Hammer on turn 2 with the coin, you really Primal Dungeoneer, you attack with the Wailing Vapor, you're looking solid. That's only if they don't play Cage Match Custodian though, so watch out for that. But the biggest question is, should you Lightning Bolt the Wailing Vapor? I'd say on turn 1, never Lightning Bolt the Wailing Vapor, it makes no sense to me. On turn 2, it depends on what they play. If they play Cage Match Custodian, I might consider it, depending on what my hand looks like. If my hand's full of a bunch of junk that I can't play, then I'd say, hey, let's Lightning Bolt that. I don't have anything that can counter it. If you have your own Wailing Vapor, you say you top decked it on your turn 2, I just play that and Lightning Bolt. Because if a Cage Match Custodian is played, if this Whack-A-Mole Hammer hits that Wailing Vapor, like I said before, that 4 health is too much for you to deal with. If no Cage Match Custodian is played, you have more leeway, and I probably wouldn't Lightning Bolt it at that point. It all depends though. Most people don't keep the Whack-A-Mole Hammer in their mulligan, so if they kept a bunch of cards, they might not actually have the hammer. You just don't want this Wailing Vapor to get buffed by the Whack-A-Mole Hammer. That's a big no-no, and that's how you'll lose against the Wailing Vapor. To sum it up, play your minions to counter it if you can. If you can't play any minions, you want to set up for Serpentine, Whack-A-Mole Hammer, and if you're really desperate and you don't have anything to play, you can play your Lightning Bolt. Also, a Red Stormer and to some extent Earth Revenant is good enough too to just help deal with that board, and if you're running Gyre Worm, you want to play that as well. The next opening we're going to look at is what happens when someone plays Kindling Elemental. The common openings for Kindling Elemental are Kindling Elemental into Wailing Vapor, or if you have coin, you can play Wailing Vapor first into Kindling Elemental. You can also play Kindling Elemental into another Kindling Elemental, and that's good for some combos with maybe Cage Match Custodian. But the biggest thing that you should be scared of is Kindling Elemental into a Red Stormer. And even more scary from that, it's Whack-A-Mole Hammer, because I'm here to tell you, if that happens to you and you're going against someone who has this opening, you're going to lose. There's nothing you can really do about it. But how do you counter this when they go first? So they play Kindling Elemental on turn 1. Of course you don't Lightning Bolt it, it's not worth it. You want to play your minions just like Wailing Vapor, but if you can't play your minions, you pass. Let's say they play a Cage Match Custodian now. This is why we should keep Serpentine Portal. This is why you should keep Whack-A-Mole Hammer. Because whenever they do that, you play your Serpentine Portal, boom, you have a 3-drop on the board. And they have a Whack-A-Mole Hammer. And then it turns out with a bit of trading, this becomes a 2-3 on the board. The board's sort of equal. You're at a disadvantage, but you're not totally losing. But the more important thing is you want to get Whack-A-Mole Hammer. Let's go back a bit. You play your Whack-A-Mole Hammer on turn 3 with 3 mana, take out that Cage Match Custodian, that thing is gone. And then, even though you don't have a minion, if they play their own Whack-A-Mole Hammer, they attack face, they go boom, that's a 2-3 now. They did 5 damage to your face, but more importantly, you can do something on turn 4. If you play Earth Revenant on turn 4, it's extremely powerful if you attack into it, because now that's a 3-7. And how does the Shaman deal with a 3-7? And that is why you should keep your Whack-A-Mole Hammers, because you can still fight for the board. Sure, it might be better if you just have minions on the board, but personally, I don't know if I want to take that risk of trying to get a 1 or 2 cost minions. Again, it's your choice. Would you rather play it super safe and keep the Whack-A-Mole Hammer and guarantee a little bit worse position? Or would you risk it and mulligan for your 1-drop cards? It's up to you. If your opponent plays Kindling Elemental and you go second, you have even more counterplay. If you're on turn 1, you might want to consider coining out Cage Match Custodian. It's not the safest thing you can do, but if they don't have a Red Stormer, they actually can't deal with your Cage Match Custodian. The big thing you can do though is coin a Whack-A-Mole Hammer. You can attack into the Cage Match Custodian, and then if you have Primal Dungeoneer in your hand, you can attack the next turn, and then that becomes a 3-4. And that's really hard to deal with, like we said before. 4 health minions are hard for Elemental Shaman to deal with because of all of this stuff, right? In general though, the same idea applies. Play your minions to counter it. Maybe coin out Whack-A-Mole Hammer or Serpentine Portal if you decided to keep it, and you shouldn't Lightning Bolt the Kindling Elemental. With those big openings out of the way, what's wrong with Primal Dungeoneer? Yes, it's a good card, you get a 3-mana minion, but lots of the time, it's not fast enough on the board. Of course, you should still keep it if you get a bad opening hand before the mulligan, but just know that compared to other cards, it's not going to bring as much tempo as you think. This card is great with Whack-A-Mole Hammer if you can get it to 4 health, but in the Elemental Shaman mirror matchup, it's important to know you should look at this card more as a refill and not as a good tempo minion. There's actually a lot of cards which have a different purpose in the Elemental Shaman mirror matchup. We'll start with the Earth Revenant, whose played win rate just scares me. I know a lot of people would think this card as removal, but if you have a good board, plopping this thing down isn't a bad way to protect your minions. Even if your opponent doesn't have a board, 6 health on turn 4 or 5 is hard to get through. Why this is so effective as a wall has to do with the amount of burst damage in this deck. There's 28 burst damage in this deck and 40 damage if you can attack without taunts. So, a lot of the time you can deal damage and finish off with those burst cards. That's why Earth Revenant is so good, because the minion-based Elemental Shaman will have to sacrifice a lot of board or burst to take him off. Though this deck is minion-based, Lilypad Lurker is not only a great way to deal with fire elementals and so on, but sometimes a 5 and a 5/6 can be good enough to play in general with that hex ability as well. I'm not saying do it a lot, but if you know this room, then you might be able to play him a bit more often. But you should really play Instructor Fireheart more often in general. There are 23 spells in Shaman that you can play with Fireheart, 5 of them can do damage directly to the face, and 11 of them cost 2 or less mana. I'm not the best at math, so I'm not going to try to do it, but I'm sure if you play this on turn 7, the 4 mana you have to play around with will do something good. But none of this matters if you don't see it in action. So here are some scenarios which will teach you the thought process of how to deal with the Elemental Shaman Mirror matchup. This is where all the tips are in action, so let's start with this. Also, I'm playing against my friend because I wasn't about to play standard for the chance to play against Elemental Shaman. Sorry, I'm not sorry. This first game shows you how strong a Red Stormer is in the early game. Just like here at the Kindling Elemental and the Red Stormer combo. Right here is when the real first interaction of the game is. My opponent Serpent Stride portaled my Red Stormer, but it got a 3/2 Divine Shield on the board. The question now is, should I trade or should I not trade into it? I could play Dunk Tank too, but that would really be a waste. Here I used the Menacing Nimbus first, and since I know there's a Whack-A-Mole Hammer in his hand because he used Cage Match Custodian, I'd rather not have to deal with a 4/3 Divine Shield, so I trade. Now I'm looking at my hand and I see that there's a Lilypad Lurker on a weak board. Shaman didn't play an Elemental last turn, so they can't Lilypad Lurker me back, so I decided it was safe enough to play on the 2/3. After quick clear by my opponent, the next turn is tricky. I don't have many good cards to play right now, and I want to use Fire Elemental on the face or a minion with more attack. So I don't really want to Fire Elemental the Earth Revenant. I still know the Whack-A-Mole Hammer is in his hand, so I don't want that thing alive to tank for the other minions. I also see that I have a Brukan and an Instructor Fireheart to deal burst damage, so I think it's safe enough to use Dunk Tank to take out the minion. But not after playing Menacing Nimbus first. Remember to always draw first. Then I get Lilypad Lurkered and that's kind of bad for me. But here's the thing though, there's a taunt on my side of the board now. I might be able to squeak out a few bits of damage right now and then burst him down for the win. So instead of playing for board control, which I'm starting to not have, I decided to start hitting the face and bursting them down over a few turns. And good thing I started hitting face because my opponent has a corrupted Dunk Tank and cleared my board. If your opponent's hand is this big, you should expect some sort of burst removal from them. Right now the situation isn't looking good for me, but my opponent is fairly low thanks to that face damage I put on. I played my Steward of Scrolls I got from Menacing Nimbus because every other card wouldn't have given me enough tempo to win, and I needed a bit more burst. If you look at my hand right now, I have 7 damage with Dunk Tank and Brukan, so I really only need 6 more damage to win the game. Too bad I wasn't able to get that 6 damage, but I was able to take out the biggest threat on the board. But the problem is still here. I have to deal 6 damage, but thankfully I drew a Whack-A-Mole Hammer which allowed me to do 2-turn lethal. Here's the thing though, I should have played Instructor Fireheart first because that draws me a card, so don't get excited and misplay folks. After a few Fireheart procs, I was able to clear the board and get another Lightning Bolt to help with lethal. And with the board my opponent's building, it's a good thing this game didn't go on much longer. If I haven't dealt that 4 damage with the Fire Elemental earlier, I might have died before I got the chance to play on my burst. So now I can use Brukan and Dunk Tank for the win. But the next game shows you the importance of making a wide board and the power of Earth Revenant. I stay true to my word and I keep the Whack-A-Mole Hammer if I go second, and you'll see how good it is. Here I get lucky and I draw a Kindling Elemental, and even luckier when the opponent doesn't play anything for the first 2 turns. Now I push on the pressure with the wide board, so I use the coin and get the Wailing Vapor and the Red Stormer combo. I know it's not really a combo, shut up. The opponent can't even do anything to the board right now, and good thing I kept Whack-A-Mole Hammer because I easily get board control with it and a lot of face damage. My opponent Dunk Tanks my 3/4, so that tells me that they can't effectively deal with the board anytime soon, and I should keep putting on the pressure. They probably don't have many good minions to play either because they would have played it. Here I attack with my weapon first in hopes that the buff hits the Red Stormer. It didn't, but the Earth Revenant is a good enough wall in case a Whack-A-Mole Hammer is played, or if they played an Elemental last turn, it'd be a great wall for the Red Stormer as well. And from there, I used all my bursts and I got a quick win with the deck. Here's the game where the opponent had a better hand than I did. I got Kindling Elemental, but they got the Wailing Vapor combo. Here's the first decision I made in this matchup. Do I trade the 1/2 into the 1/2? I traded because I thought that 1 damage to the face probably wouldn't matter compared to dealing with the board, but I was wrong, because if I didn't attack with my 1/2 into their 1/2, it could have still been alive to trade into the Wailing Vapor. So basically, I was stupid. Still, you gotta just keep on playing after a misplay. So I used a whack-a-mole hammer and I attacked into the 3-1. My opponent top decks and a Rid Stormer, but this is why Earth Revenant is so strong in this matchup. It's not the battle cry, but it's the 2/6 taunt combined with the weapon buff that makes it so strong. Even if the Stormer gets buffed, it still can't clearly trade into the Earth Revenant. Should the opponent even have attacked into my Earth Revenant? Probably not, but maybe they were just scared I can do something to deal with it. A turn later, I'm faced with the situation thanks to Serpentine Portal. I've got a fire elemental, so I want to corrupt my dunk tanks. I know that I'm not going to win on the board because of this stupid guy, so I want to start dealing damage to the face. That being said, I still take out the totem with my battle cry because 3 damage isn't that hard to do as an elemental shaman. But I wouldn't blame you if you went face here. Now, after my opponent refilled his hand a bit, I went for a 50-50 with a weapon buff and won. I'm thinking I want to start dealing damage to the face because I've got 8 burst damage in my hand and another way to deal more burst damage via Primal Dungeoneer. After my board is cleared from fair and balanced gameplay, I make another mistake here. I could have played a minion before and then attacked face with the weapon, but I played Lilypad Lurker first and I missed out 3 damage to the face. And here comes the loop of the deck. If I play a Lilypad Lurker, they can play their Lilypad Lurker. But I'm a bit better and I got 1 more of them, so then I play it again. Then I dunk tank to assure my Lilypad Lurker stays alive to deal 5 damage, rather than the dunk tank dealing 4 damage to the face while a 4/3 is alive on the board. If you look at my hand, I actually have 14 damage, so why don't I just dunk tank the face? Well, remember, the mirror matchup has the same burst potential on both sides, so I'm not willing to take the risk when I can easily set up a multi-turn lethal with the burst damage and decent board control. And just for insult to injury, I top deck Brucan so I get lethal in 1 turn instead of 2. This matchup is extremely volatile, so pay extra attention to when you think they have burst damage and can end you. Just like the next matchup I'm going to cover, which is going to be Elemental Shaman versus Face Hunter. So if you want to see that and other fun Hearthstone videos, you should subscribe. And if you're looking to just have a fun time while watching some Hearthstone, you should check out this playlist right here. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you around.